Welcome to In-Silico Trials Real Impact, the In-Silico UK podcast that's revolutionizing the way we think about medical innovation. I'm Professor Alejandro Frangi from the University of Manchester, and I'll be your guide through this fascinating world of in-silico technologies. In each episode, we'll dive into cutting-edge research and groundbreaking news that are shaping the future of medical product development and regulation. From computational modeling to simulated clinical trials, we are exploring how digital approaches are transforming healthcare, making it safer, more efficient, more equitable, and incredibly precise. So, whether you're a researcher, regulator, a member of the public, or a patient representative, or simply curious about the future of medicine, tune in as we unravel the complex world of in-silico methods and their real-world impact. Get ready to discover how computer-simulated trials are leading to very real breakthroughs in patient care. In-Silico Trials, Real Impact, where algorithms and data are saving lives. Let's begin.
All right, so we've got this paper here all about in-silico clinical trials for medical devices.
Yeah.
And the big focus is on, can we trust these virtual trials?
Absolutely.
Especially when we're talking about making actual decisions about real devices that could be used on real people.
It's a huge deal, right?
Yeah.
Because it's one thing to design something on a computer and have it work perfectly.
Right.
But then how do you translate that to the real world? How do you know it's actually going to work in a real patient?
Yeah, exactly. So that's where this hierarchical framework comes in, this idea of breaking the whole process down into smaller, more manageable chunks.
Right, like building blocks.
Okay, I like that.
And the paper actually uses the analogy of Lego bricks, which I think is really helpful.
So walk me through this Lego analogy.
Well,
what are the key bricks we're working with here?
Well, the first one is the device model.
Okay, the device model.
So this is essentially the virtual version of the device itself.
Got it.
Like a digital blueprint, if
Right.
you will.
So let's say we're testing a new heart valve. The device model would be like
a super detailed 3D model of that valve.
showing how it opens and closes and all that.
Exactly. All the intricate details of its shape, the materials it's made of, and the physics of how it's designed to work.
Okay, so it's more than just a pretty picture. It has to actually simulate how the device functions.
Absolutely. And to make sure we can trust this model, we need to do two key things: verification and validation.
All right, but break those down for me. Verification versus validation. What's the difference?
So verification is all about checking the computer code itself,
Okay.
making sure that the math and the algorithms accurately reflect the scientific laws that govern how the device behaves. Things like fluid dynamics or the properties of the materials, that sort of thing.
So making sure the simulation is built on solid scientific ground.
Precisely. Then validation is where we take the model's predictions and compare them to real-world data.
Uh-huh.
This could be data from bench tests, where you actually physically test the device in a lab setting.
Right, so you're checking to see if the virtual device behaves like the real one.
Exactly. If the model's predictions match up with what we observe in the real world, it gives us more confidence that we're on the right track.
Got it. So the device model is our first Lego brick.
Right. But a device doesn't work in isolation. We need to think about the patient, too.
That's where the patient model comes in.
Exactly. And this is where things get really complex because we're trying to simulate the human body.
Yeah, no two people are exactly alike.
Exactly. And the paper really emphasizes this point. It says virtual patients need to be similar in a precisely defined way to real patients.
Okay, so break that down for me. What does that actually mean in practice?
So it means we can't just create one generic virtual patient and call it a day. We need to account for all the variability that exists in the real world.
So differences in age, sex, body size, underlying health conditions, all of that.
All of that. We don't want our virtual patients to be perfect clones of real people, but they need to have the same relevant characteristics.
So we need a whole range of virtual patients.
Exactly. And that brings us to the virtual patient cohort model.
All right, the virtual patient cohort.
Think of it like creating a diverse cast of digital characters, each with slightly different characteristics that reflect the real-world population.
So we're basically building a virtual population to test our device on.
Exactly. And this is crucial for making sure the results of the In-Silico trial are applicable to a wide range of people in the real world.
Right, because what works for one virtual patient might not work for another.
Exactly. So we need to make sure our virtual population is representative of the diversity of patients who might use the device in real life.
So how do we know we've built a believable virtual population?
Well, validation of this virtual cohort involves comparing its characteristics to real-world population data. We want to make sure our digital population accurately reflects the diversity of patients who might use the device in real life.
Okay, so like the same range of ages, the same proportion of men and women, the same prevalence of certain health conditions, that sort of thing.
Precisely. We need to make sure our virtual patients are like real people in all the ways that matter for testing this device.
Makes sense. Okay, so we've got our virtual device, we've got our virtual patients. What happens next?
Now we get to the exciting part. The coupled device patient model.
Okay, coupled device patient model. What's that all about?
This is where we virtually implant the device into our digital patients and see what happens.
Oh, wow.
We can simulate things like how a hip implant fits into a virtual pelvis, or how blood flows through a virtual heart valve, or how a stent expands inside a virtual artery.
It's like doing virtual surgery.
Yeah, it really is. And it's an incredibly powerful tool for understanding how the device will interact with the body in a dynamic way.
But how do we know that this virtual surgery is a credible representation of what would actually happen in a real patient?
That's a great question. Validation for this coupled model often involves comparing its predictions to data from bench tests with realistic phantoms, or even to results from animal studies, where the device is implanted in a living organism.
So you're looking for a consistency between the virtual world and those more controlled physical settings.
Exactly. If our virtual surgery produces similar outcomes to what we observe in those settings, it increases our confidence in the model's reliability.
It's all starting to feel very much like a very elaborate, high-tech video game. But I do have a question. Even the best surgeons in the world, they're not robots, right? They make decisions in the moment. They have to adapt to unexpected situations. Sometimes things just don't go perfectly according to plan. How do you capture that human element in a virtual trial?
That's a fantastic point. And it highlights the importance of the next brick in our framework, the clinician model.
Okay, the clinician model.
This model attempts to simulate how a surgeon would use the device in a real-world setting, taking into account the variability and nuances of human judgment and actions.
So we're actually programming a virtual surgeon into the simulation.
Exactly. And it's more than just following a set of pre-programmed instructions. We want to capture the fact that surgeons make decisions based on the specific patient, the situation at hand, their own experience and expertise.
Yeah, like every surgery is unique in some way.
Precisely. So we might program the virtual surgeon to implant the device in slightly different ways, just like a real doctor would, to reflect that inherent variability in surgical technique. It really is a fascinating challenge trying to capture that, the artistry of surgery in a computational model.
Yeah.
But it's so crucial if we want these virtual trials to reflect, the messiness of the real world.
Totally. And it makes you realize just how much we rely on human skill and judgment, even with all this advanced technology.
Absolutely.
But, okay, so we've got our virtual device, our virtual patients, our virtual surgeon. What's the missing piece here? Because ultimately we care about patient outcomes, right? Like a virtual heart valve working properly is great and all that.
Right.
But does it actually translate to a patient feeling better, living longer, having a better quality of life?
That's the ultimate goal. Right. And that's where the final brick in this hierarchical framework comes in the clinical outcome mapping model.
All right, let's talk about that. What exactly is clinical outcome mapping?
So this model takes all the data that we've generated in our virtual trial, things like blood flow rates, stress on the device, how the virtual surgeon implanted it. It tries to link all of that to real-world clinical outcomes that actually matter to patients.
Right.
Things like pain levels, mobility, risk of complications, even things like how long they stay in the hospital.
So it's taking all the complex data from the simulation and asking, okay, so what does this actually mean for the patient's health?
Exactly. And validating this clinical outcome mapping model is, it's essential, but it can also be really challenging.
I bet.
Because it often requires us to have real-world clinical data, maybe from early feasibility studies or even just existing registries of patient outcomes.
So we need to be able to compare what we're seeing in our virtual world to what's actually happening with real patients.
Exactly. We need to confirm that those virtual outcomes actually translate to meaningful differences in how real people feel and function.
It's like we've just constructed this incredibly complex, multi-layered Lego masterpiece of a virtual trial.
Kind of, yeah.
But before we get too carried away celebrating, let's zoom out for a second and think about the implications of all this.
Yeah.
We're talking about using these In-Silico trials to make real decisions about medical devices, potentially even to get those devices approved for use in patients.
Right.
So how do we ensure that these virtual trials are actually trustworthy, that they're producing reliable, meaningful results that we can base those decisions on.
I think that's exactly where this hierarchical framework really shines.
Okay.
It's not about just checking boxes or making the most complicated model possible. It's about building trust.
Right, because at the end of the day, clinicians and regulatory bodies, they need to have confidence that these in silico trials are the real deal. No one's going to approve a new device based on a video game simulation unless they're absolutely convinced that it reflects reality.
Exactly. And that's why this rigorous step-by-step approach to verification and validation that we've been talking about, it's so crucial.
It's like the difference between building a Lego castle for fun and building a Lego bridge that people will actually drive across. You better be darn sure those bricks are strong and connected properly if you're putting real lives on the line.
I love that analogy. And it brings up another important point. Model risk assessment.
Okay, model risk assessment. That sounds a bit like something a bank would do, not doctors.
It might sound that way, but the principle's the same. Before you even start building your virtual trial, you need to ask yourself, what are the stakes here? What are the potential consequences if our model gets it wrong?
So are we talking about tweaking the design of the device a little bit, or are we making decisions about whether this device is safe and effective enough to be used in life-saving surgery?
Exactly. And that's where this decision tree approach that they mentioned in the paper, it can be really helpful.
Okay, how so?
Well, you start with the question that your trial is trying to answer.
Mm-hmm.
For example, is this new stent safe and effective for treating blocked arteries?
Right.
And then you map out the potential consequences of different answers, like what happens if the model predicts the stent works great, but in reality, it has a high risk of complications?
Well, that could have serious consequences for patients.
Exactly. So the decision tree helps you visualize those potential consequences and understand the level of risk that's associated with relying on the model's predictions.
It's like a risk-benefit analysis for the virtual trial itself.
Exactly. And the higher the risk, the more evidence we need to gather to support the model's credibility.
Okay, let's talk evidence. Where do you even begin to gather enough data to support something as complex as a whole virtual clinical trial? It seems like a pretty daunting task.
It can be, but the paper lays out a strategic approach.
Okay.
They really emphasize the importance of tapping into evidence from every stage of the device's development. So that means bench tests, animal studies, early clinical trials. It's like gathering clues from all these different sources to build a solid case for your model's reliability.
So it's not just about the computer model itself. It's about anchoring that model in real-world data.
Precisely. And this is where the hierarchical framework is really helpful because we've broken down the trial into these smaller submodels, right? So we can actually gather targeted evidence to support each piece individually.
So for the device model, you might use data from bench tests to show that the virtual device behaves like the real one. For the patient model, you might use data from animal studies or even existing patient registries to validate those virtual anatomies and physiologies.
Exactly. And for that really crucial clinical outcome mapping model, we might need data from real patient follow-up studies to confirm those links between the virtual world and real-world outcomes.
Like a multi-pronged approach to building trust.
Yeah.
You're constantly cross-referencing, comparing the model's predictions to different types of real-world data. But I imagine all of this gathering evidence, it must be incredibly time-consuming and expensive.
It can be, yeah, especially for smaller companies or for folks who are developing, brand new cutting edge devices where there isn't much existing data to draw on.
Right.
But one strategy that the paper suggests is to carefully plan those early studies, both preclinical and clinical, to maximize the amount of relevant data that they generate.
So it's about working smarter, not just harder.
Precisely. You're designing those studies not just to answer the immediate research question, but also to generate valuable evidence that can feed into building and validating your virtual trial model. It's a long-term investment that can ultimately pay off in faster, safer, and more efficient device development down the road.
It's like planting seeds that will eventually grow into a whole forest of evidence to support the use of in-silico trials.
Exactly. And if we can get this right, if we can establish that trust and credibility, I think in-silico trials have the potential to really revolutionize the medical device industry.
Okay, so let's shift gears for a moment and talk about that bigger picture. What are the broader implications of this framework for the adoption of these trials? Is this just a theoretical concept, or is this something that's actually going to change how medical devices are developed?
Well, I think this framework, it provides a roadmap, a really clear path forward for developers, for regulators, for clinicians. It lays out a very systematic way to assess and address the challenges of building trustworthy virtual trials.
So it's not just a bunch of ideas. It's a practical guide for actually implementing these trials in the real world.
Exactly. And by providing that clarity and that structure, it can help build confidence and encourage wider adoption of these innovative approaches.
But it also highlights the fact that this isn't a quick fix, right? Building trust in these virtual trials, it's an ongoing process.
Absolutely. It requires that rigorous attention to detail, commitment to gathering high-quality evidence, and constant collaboration between engineers, scientists, clinicians, and regulators.
This has been a fascinating deep dive into the world of in-silico clinical trials.
It has.
It's a complex topic, but one that holds immense potential.
Absolutely. And as these virtual trials become more common, it's really important for everyone, developers, regulators, clinicians, patients, to understand how they work, what their limitations are, and how they can be used responsibly to advance the health and well-being of all.
So as we wrap up our exploration of this paper, I want to leave our listeners with a final thought.
Okay.
What role will you play in shaping this future of medical innovation? What questions will you ask? What contributions will you make? The future of healthcare, it's being written right now, and it's up to all of us to make sure that it's a future that benefits everyone. So we've really dug into this hierarchical framework.
Yeah.
And it seemed like a pretty solid approach for building trust in these in-silico trials,
It does, right. And by providing those clear guidelines for verification and validation and highlighting how important gathering evidence and assessing risk is, I think it could really open the door for wider acceptance.
Yeah.
And adoption of these virtual trials.
It makes you wonder, what could this actually mean for, the future of medical device development? Are we on the verge of this paradigm shift where virtual trials become the standard, or is that still, way off in the future?
It's hard to say for sure, but I think we're at a really interesting point right now, The technology is evolving so quickly, and there's this growing awareness of all the potential benefits these in-silico trials could bring, especially when we're talking about things like speed and cost and patient safety.
Because think about it, if you can test a new device on 100 virtual patients in a matter of days or weeks versus having to wait months or even years to recruit real patients for a traditional clinical trial, that could be a game changer.
Exactly. And it allows you to explore a much wider range of design options, test different scenarios, identify those potential problems really early on, all in that safe virtual environment.
Right.
So it could lead to devices that are safer and more effective and get to patients faster.
It's not just about speed and efficiency, though. It seems like in-silico trials could also be really powerful for personalized medicine, too.
Oh, absolutely. With virtual patients, you can basically tailor the simulation to the specific characteristics of an individual patient, their anatomy, their genetics, even their lifestyle.
Wow.
And that kind of detailed modeling can help doctors select the absolute best device for each patient and predict how they're likely to respond to the treatment.
It's like having a device that's custom designed just for you.
It really is. And it could be transformative for rare diseases, too, or for those patient populations that are usually underrepresented in traditional clinical trials.
Yeah.
You can actually create these virtual cohorts that perfectly reflect those specific demographics and test the device's safety and effectiveness in a way that you just couldn't do with real patients.
It's like making medical innovation accessible to everyone.
Exactly. But as with any new technology, there are challenges we have to address. We've talked about how crucial rigorous verification and validation are and the need for clear guidelines and regulations.
Right. And even with the most amazing simulations, there are always going to be limitations. We can't perfectly replicate the human body in a computer model.
That's true, but the goal isn't necessarily to replace traditional clinical trials entirely.
Okay.
It's more about complementing them, and in-silico trials can help us design those trials more effectively, identify the most promising candidates early on, and refine our research questions.
Right.
They can also help us reduce the number of patients who are exposed to potential risks in those initial clinical studies.
So it's about using the right tool for the job and using these tools strategically to, maximize their strengths while understanding their limitations.
Exactly. And it's an evolving field. As the technology keeps getting better and we learn more about computational modeling, I think we're going to see even more creative and impactful applications of these in-silico trials in the years to come.
It sounds like we're really on the cusp of something exciting here in medical device development, like an era where virtual and real-world testing work together to, develop safer, more effective, more personalized treatments for patients faster than we ever could before.
I completely agree. And this paper that we've been discussing, with its emphasis on building that foundation of trust and credibility, it's a really important step in the right direction.
Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive into the world of in-silico clinical trials.
It really has.
It's a complex topic, but one with immense potential.
Absolutely. And as these virtual trials become more commonplace, it's critical for everyone involved, developers, regulators, clinicians, and especially patients, to understand how they work, what their limitations are, and how they can be used responsibly to really advance everyone's health and well-being.
So as we wrap up our discussion today, I want to leave our listeners with a final thought. What role will each of you play in shaping the future of medical innovation? What questions will you be asking? What contributions will you make? Because the future of healthcare is literally being written right now, and it's up to all of us to make sure that it's a future that benefits everyone.